On today's episode of Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma, it's the idea that being a Christian is important if you want to be a real American.
That same strategy is being used today to rally young conservative Catholics around anti-abortion and anti-LGBTQ+ causes.
I want to tell you this random factoid about Cate Blanchett in the middle of this podcast. Can I just tell you?
Of course.
Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
The show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
An embrace of fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
Catholic nationalism. It's growing, it's powerful, and it's shaping politics and our world in ways you might not expect. It's not just about religious belief, it's about power, control, and a vision of society that prioritizes a specific exclusionary ideology.
It's a heavy topic, but we'll get through it together. And we will offer our own perspectives on how we left conservative Catholicism and embraced our queer identities at the end of this episode.
So what happens when faith and nationalism collide? And what can we do to push back against systems of control that seek to reshape democracy in their image? It's a complicated but important topic. So let's start with the basics. What do we mean by Catholic nationalism?
First, we'll give a brief description of Christian nationalism. Brad Onashi, co-host of the Straight White American Jesus podcast, defines Christian nationalism as an ideology that is based around the idea that America is a Christian nation. They say America was founded as a Christian nation, and therefore it should be a Christian nation today and into the future.
According to survey data, Christian nationalists agree with statements like the federal government should declare the United States of America a Christian nation, that our laws should be based on Christian values. It's the idea that being a Christian is important if you want to be a real American.
Catholic nationalism, then, is an offshoot of Christian nationalism. It's essentially the blending of Catholic identity with far-right political movements that espouse the same types of views about our national identity being based on the Christian religion. For Catholics, it's largely fueled by a traditionalist movement made up of people who feel alienated by quote-unquote modern changes in the Church, especially reforms from the period post the Second Vatican Council.
And it's a viewpoint that is explicitly colonial because there were nations in this land before America was founded. So,
100%.
If we actually wanted to base our laws on the religion of the land, they would not be Christian laws. And it's also interesting about the idea of some Catholics today being alienated by changes like with Vatican II, because I've really noticed a generational element and shift there, where there are a bunch of older people who actually experienced Vatican II who are very happy about it, and yet now there's this inevitable backlash where the younger generation is well, no, we think it should have actually been how it was before. But I also recently attended a conference at Notre Dame University in Indiana with a specific focus on Christian nationalism. And they had a bunch of great examples from the Protestant world and evangelical movements about how we arrived at the present moment. But what I did notice is there wasn't as much discussion about the Catholic involvement as I had hoped. There were a few talks and presentations that referenced some Catholic fascist movements or even some of the traditionalist movements and how those things get wrapped up. But I would love to see more about it, and that's why Emma and I today are going to be talking about what we like to call the unholy alliance. If you've listened to our other episodes, you've heard this term before. And so it's because it's this unholy alliance between Christian and Catholic far-right movements. we're seeing this movement gain momentum as there's been a rise in radical traditionalist or, quote, rad trad Catholic groups that push for a return to pre Vatican II practices.
100%, exactly. Groups like the Society of St. Pius X, often annotated as SSPX, reject many modern church teachings, including ecumenism and liturgical reforms. Some even question the legitimacy of Pope Francis aligning their ideology with far right nationalism. And that's something that we'll delve into deeper throughout this podcast, and something that we did in our masculinity series, specifically focusing on the overlap and interplay of far right Catholic leaders and American politicians at the moment. This type of thinking, specifically questioning the legitimacy of Pope Francis, is called sede vacantism. And it's a traditionalist Catholic belief that the papacy is currently vacant, specifically the term sede vacantism. And it means that the current line of the popes is not valid and that the See of Rome is currently unoccupied due to alleged heresy or apostasy. These ideas are being amplified through social media and conservative media outlets in ways that seem easy to dismiss if you're outside the bubble, like for both of us, but are growing louder as we begin to actually see these folks take on real power within the communities. And that's something we'll discuss further with these leaders. As well as the alignment of specifically radical traditionalist Catholic movements with far right political organizations and ideologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally think that's true. That it seems very strange from a Catholic perspective to want to be Catholic but to deny the Pope. Because like kind of the whole thing about being Catholic is that you recognize the Pope.
Yeah.
And so some of these people who hold some of these beliefs or just hold extreme conservative beliefs can be very active through media like EWTN, which is the Eternal Word Television Network. It's a fundamentalist and conservative Catholic television network. According to Michael Sean Winters of the National Catholic Reporter in a 2019 article, Raymond Arroyo, who has a show on EWTN, has become a mouthpiece for the anti Francis, pro Trump faction within the church, offering uncritical interviews with ideological allies like Steve Bannon, who is also Catholic.
Mhm.
Arroyo also, I believe now he appears frequently on Fox News, so that's another alliance. Here I am as a person who's a host of a Catholic television network, and I'm also frequently going on Fox News. That communicates something and sends a message. But it's not just about media. It's also about the religious symbols of Catholicism that become co-opted by these nationalist movements. Things like the sacraments, the actual physical structure of the church with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows, the way you dress up to attend Sunday Mass in your Sunday best, and devotional objects like the rosary.
Right. Daniel Panetton wrote about how the rosary has been co opted as a militant symbol, much like red hats and American flags in Christian nationalist spaces. It was something we touched on in the masculinity series about the aesthetics of far right Christian and Catholic movements. These symbols reinforce the idea of a spiritual battle against modern secularism. And for some, even just political extremism is being justified in the name of defending the faith itself. And this symbolism, just as it's critical to our practice of the faith and providing key insight into who is part of the church and who is not, it's also a signal to people who are part of far right, anti Francis, pro Trump circles about who is buying into those ideologies.
Yeah, because the whole thing for Catholics is that things aren't just symbolic, that the Eucharist is
Exactly.
genuinely the body of Christ. And so coming from that world where, for example, like when I was growing up, I don't know if I've ever asked you about this, Emma, so I'm not sure about your experience, but I never knew anything about LGBTQ people. Like we didn't have access to media or discussions about LGBTQ people. I didn't even know all those letters. I probably knew that some people were different and that wasn't something we should talk about. But for example, growing up as a young transgender person, I just didn't even know the word trans. So I think that's another element too, is that when all you have is these symbols, like, or devotionals, the rosary, when you have these very concrete things that are part of the visual landscape of what it means, it kind of fuses with your identity in a way that is very difficult to challenge further on. And that's something we will address a bit when we share a bit more about our own stories. But I just wanted to throw that out there because, as two people who have been in these fundamentalist spaces, we both really do actually understand what it's like to feel those pressures about these identities. It's easy now to look at it in a observational way and critique it and dig into it, but we also do really understand what it was like to go through it. There's been a real push to merge Catholic identity with political extremism, including efforts to influence elections and push a hardline conservative agenda in both the United States and in Europe.
100%. And more to come on Poland. Yes. And one key moment was Phyllis Schlafly, who you might remember from the series Mrs. America, mobilizing Christians along with
Cate
Catholic.
Blanchett. You have
Yes.
to,
Cate Blanchett.
all the gays who are listening to this need
Yes.
to know that Cate Blanchett plays Phyllis Schlafly, and she's so good.
And there is queer representation in the show, so very important.
I want to tell you this random factoid about Cate Blanchett in the middle of this podcast. Can I just tell you?
Of course.
So apparently she hates leaf blowers, and she wears a pin that has a symbol of a leaf blower with it slashed through.
It reminds me of like in rural Indiana, there used to be the things about the windmills. And you'd like drive past people's houses and see like symbols of the windmills with like the giant like red circle and crossed out.
Yes.
And I was like, what is happening? So, one key moment was Phyllis Schlafly mobilizing Christian along with Catholic women against the Equal Rights Amendment of the 70s and 80s. And you all know I'm a public historian and I love any chance that we get to dip into these histories. So, that same strategy is being used today to rally young conservative Catholics around anti abortion and anti LGBTQ plus causes, framing these issues as part of a broader spiritual war. And one thing I want to highlight with this is one of the big pushes, especially with the last several elections, has been essentializing the issues surrounding the electoral decisions and voting, of thinking about abortion, about LGBTQ plus rights, about access to different elements of reproductive care and reproductive justice as being the singular issue on which the election should be decided. And that was something that was very much mobilized by conservatives during Schlafly's time, but also during our time today.
Yes, and I think that, your interest in the historical elements here is genuinely super important, because the truth is that, first of all, the movements that we see today came from somewhere. That's very important.
Mhm.
And secondly, going back to what I was saying about not having much information about LGBTQ identities growing up, I also didn't know about the history of LGBTQ identities. So, it's let's take history out of this idea of this like academic, dry, dusty study. We also need to show that actually, hey, like, there, these things come from somewhere. And I think that fundamentalism doesn't like history because it doesn't want you to be able to trace other thoughts that could challenge whatever the fundamentalist view is holding. But then also, we have plenty of contemporary examples too, because I'm thinking of the Kansas City Chiefs kicker, if you care about football at all, which I really don't. But
You probably heard his name for other comments recently, though.
yes, exactly. And his was it a commencement speech that he gave, Emma?
It was. It was at a Catholic university.
Right. And so he is somebody who is openly critical of Pope Francis and progressive politics, aligning himself with the traditional Latin Mass movement. And the comments that he made, I believe, were on the theme of basically women shouldn't go to college, or like shouldn't have aspirational ideas, and they should just be happy to serve as members of the household that are supporting men, basically.
100%. He specifically had said something that really exploded online about the idea of women stepping aside and
Stepping
kind of
aside.
men taking over in that direction, which is something we see throughout a lot of Christian and nationalist rhetoric.
Yes, and I remember that. I was like, That for me was a moment that was very much like, whoa, is this interpretation of Catholicism more mainstream than I thought, going back to that idea of the bubble?
100%. I do have one small note about that as well, because
Sure.
people who are listening probably also heard Harrison Butker's comments in context with a lot of comments from resurfaced comments from JD Vance and President Trump about childless cat ladies. So those of you who are familiar with the situation probably also heard these ideas coming up at the same time. And I think a lot of it was tied to the idea and association of nationalism with natalism. So it's something that we delve deeper into in the masculinity series, but the idea that for a Catholic or a Christian nationalist community or a nation to be successful, it has to produce more people that believe and conform to this ideology. So a bunch of that was concern about women that weren't submitting to the idea or the expectation that they have many, many children.
Yeah, so what you're saying is basically that there is also subtext. Like sometimes it'll be like they're saying one thing, but really they're communicating something else, to kind of like a dog whistle.
100%, 100%. And I think here it's the idea of a gender dog whistle, especially in all of these different conversations. And it's something that's not only with Harrison Butker and with other politicians, but most recently, a lot of traditionalist Catholic accounts online have been recirculating the video of JD Vance saying, "I want more American babies," and seeing
Which is
this,
so cringy.
which is so cringy and also conflates with the idea of like Catholic big families that I think fits in their conception well into the idea of a nationalist and Catholic nation of, oh, well, Catholic families normally have like 12, 13, 14 children. But of course, that was related to access to reproductive care and birth control at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, whenever I think about the elements related to having a big family, I can't help but think, we have so much data and information today, and more understanding about children, period. Like, just think of the advancements in like science of understanding how children work, childhood development, things of that nature, that we've had like just in the last 50 years. So to me, there's also a concern of, okay, this, like we talked about in the last episode, this idea of an old-timey religion or something that's old. I don't think that children were treated especially well for much of history, and like
No,
there's a reason why we also have like labor laws that prevent children from being like employed. Like there are a lot of different levels here that I also feel are important.
100%. And we also have to put in context that bigger families were more common, yes, because um, access to birth control was not regulated, but also there was different constructions about um, forms of consent within marriage, but also that many children didn't make it to adulthood because they didn't have access to the vaccinations and healthcare that we do today, which are now under threat.
Absolutely. And that also makes me think of Bug Hall, who we mentioned in our masculinity series. He is a traditionalist Catholic who most people would know because of his role as an actor in Little Rascals. But he's very vocal online. And the connection that I thought of immediately from what you were saying was he said that he was going to, once his daughters came of age and had suitors, that he would basically interrogate any suitor on various points, and one of the points is on his position on the marital debt, which is another dog whistle for those issues that of consent that you were just discussing. So a lot of very concerning elements. He also was somebody who said, finally I have an heir, when his son was born after already having daughters. So just a very public demonstration of devaluing women that many of the people commenting took issue with, and that he immediately responded to in a very troll way, which I think is like endemic of so-called Catholic Twitter. I guess now it's Catholic X, but maybe that doesn't have the same ring to it. People like Bug Hall and Harrison Butker, they represent a growing trend of public figures using their platforms to spread traditionalist Catholic nationalist views, oftentimes using those dog whistles or little subtextual comments that we've discussed. Another example would be Joseph Strickland, former bishop of the Tyler, Texas diocese, who, in denying the authority of the Pope and getting himself removed from being a bishop, has overtly aligned himself with a Protestant tradition.
100%. And I think that's the heart of the issue, is talking about the idea that in many ways denying the legitimacy of Pope Francis is what sparked so many different Christian denominations themselves. Um, and it's not just about individuals, it's about institutions too. The currently defunct church militant media outlet, led by the now disgraced Michael Voris, played a huge role in pushing Catholic nationalist rhetoric, and was even linked to the January 6th insurrection of the Capitol.
Which I didn't even know, Emma, until you put that in the notes. And it makes total sense. But, like, if you have more about that, I would love to hear it.
100%. So I will mention that the church militant itself, for more information about what that was. So the church militant was a pretty far right um, group. It was a far right Catholic media outlet that was the founder resigned in about 2023 over breach of a morality clause. And so church militant, and then Michael Voris also was president of St. Michael's Media. So Militant was a Michigan-based enterprise that was established to address what Voris had called, quote, the serious erosion of the Catholic faith in the last 50 years.
Didn't Michael Voris also have like a conversion story for sexuality as well? I
He
think
did.
that element is very interesting to add too.
100%. 100%. So that was something that on GladTrad 6.1, the podcast itself, they actually delve into his idea of the conversion story, and how it connected to his own sexuality. So he was what is now being classified as like the ex-gay movement. He was an anti-gay Catholic.
And even just the name of their group, Church Militant,
Yeah.
just in and of itself, this idea of a militarized force kind of brings that to mind. It kind of does marry well with the idea of January 6th and what it represented for, at the Notre Dame conference, we talked about that largely from the evangelical sort of fixations and interpretations on certain parts of the Bible and using that as motivation. But here you see in the Catholic world this idea of a church militant needing to go out. And there's also this idea of fighting the culture war.
100%. And I think it conflates with this idea that there was a really wonderful piece in Religion Dispatches about this, and also in Vanity Fair, about this idea that radical traditionalist communities that are part of pushing against Pope Francis and his legitimacy are very much like acting and creating their own insurrection in the same sense as January 6th from inside of the church. So this idea of this militant revolution against what they see as like a culture war is very much just copy and paste the same systems of resistance and revolution that we see on a larger scale in the United States.
All I can say is that I'm glad that back in my conservative video production days that I did not go for an interview at Church Militant, because I almost did.
Oh
There
my
was an
gosh.
opening. There was an opening when I was like just around the time of graduating Franciscan University, another, conservative stronghold. So I'm just glad that I didn't get involved with that because, whew.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine. Well, and it's hard because up until I think for many people, because Church Militant was known in very isolated far right Catholic circles, there wasn't a deeper dive into the background of Michael Voris and these organizations and the work that they were talking about in the sense that they are today. I think there are a lot of internal and like echo chamber style radical traditionalist groups on Reddit, on Instagram, on X that like amplify these feelings both of political conservatism but also radical traditionalist ideology.
Yeah, and also the role in these kind of siloed media environments where it's like, well, only the people who are in that algorithmic stream are receiving that type of stuff. And another one on there would be LifeSite News, which I know you've also have notes about.
So, LifeSite News, specifically, as you can probably tell from the name, is specifically concerned with abortion and anti choice networks of belief and essentializing those same ideas. So LifeSite News is a Canadian Catholic conservative anti-abortion advocacy website and news publication. And they have also been,
Canadian.
yes, very
Very
interesting.
important.
Yes. um, and along those same things, LifeSite News has has recently, and I will say this in May 2021. And I always say recent in the scale of history because for me, I'm like 1970 is totally recently. Um, but LifeSite News actually in 2021 during the pandemic was removed from Facebook for violating COVID-19 misinformation policies. Um, and they've had a lot of critical thoughts related to media bias and fact checking. So they were also the group that was inviting people to the National Prayer Service before the March for Life on Washington D.C. But also they have been very explicit about how their campaign for the quote, as they call it, the humanity of the preborn and help defend the vulnerable and defenseless, has also spilled into like other political goals related to anti-LGBTQ plus groups, but also uplifting politicians who hold an anti-abortion line, but also hold pretty extreme other ideologies. There was a piece of like exalting Elon Musk about exposing Biden's plot to import illegal immigrants, again, a problematic term because people aren't illegal, to turn US into a one party state. And the same uplifting voices like Bishop Strickland about the Novus Ordo Mass and priestly formation, which have led, they argue, to problems within the church. So again, it's amplifying these far right Catholic voices, but also like taking very pointed stands in favor of far right politicians.
Who are these Canadians, is all I'm saying.
I don't know.
And it is very striking that Catholic nationalism is starting to mirror these broader far right movements in the US, with calls to oust Pope Francis resembling efforts to overturn political leadership. The same distrust in mainstream institutions and the same conspiracy driven rhetoric and the same push to reclaim an imagined, mythologized past. There are plenty of Catholics involved in either the media infrastructure or directly in politics. We've previously mentioned people like J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Steve Bannon. There's also influencer figures from way more controversial people like Matt Walsh, Candace Owens, who recently converted to Catholicism and then like immediately was headlining one of these conservative Catholic conferences, as well as Nick Fuentes, to more acceptable figures like Bishop Barron and his Word on Fire, who has platformed questionable folks like Russell Brand, Jordan Peterson, and Shia LaBeouf.
In the same way that, as we've talked about on the masculinity series, this idea of the maniverse, which is this overarching system of far right politicians, influencers, podcasters, religious leaders who are kind of emphasizing and essentializing what it means to be a man in America today. And very much gender and sexuality is in play when we're discussing Catholic nationalism. As we've talked about, these ideas of natalism and exalting traditional gender roles, which are at the heart of many radical traditionalist Catholic movements. Communities that are also vulnerable right now, who are trying to make reason and find meaning in a world where they believe that things are radically changing from what it used to be, are seeking out Catholic nationalist and far right political scenes that they believe align with their religious and spiritual ideals. So I will point out Emma Green is a wonderful journalist who has written for The Atlantic a piece specifically about Catholic separatist movements. So the piece is titled The Christian Withdrawal Experiment, but it specifically highlights St. Mary's, Kansas, which is this Catholic community out in the middle of Kansas that has set up this very homogenous religious space. And it's the same way with this idea of Catholic nationalism, is arguing that people need to either separate themselves from the world, but also the very much the construct by far right leaders that this is the only space where they can seek out and find recognition for extremist beliefs, and that these extremist beliefs must dictate and are the sole issue for many things, just as we talked about with abortion.
And there's also, of course, the role of the internet, which is allowing more diverse groups like this to be connected. Because in the past, if you had this kind of maybe like a compound in Kansas or somewhere, you would be isolated, you would be siloed, it would be just your own little group. But today, with the internet, we have, and the role of technology, everybody is connected. And again, it's very important to highlight essentially the conspiracy pipelines, where if you start to look into one, YouTube is going to feed you another video on that topic. If you join even maybe an innocent enough Facebook group about maybe crunchy living, or one of those groups that's devoted to, let's make food that is more from the earth, and it's not processed, it's not from a big chain, it's something that we grew. Well, perhaps that will be content that is modeled by a trad wife influencer. And then suddenly, as those videos start being fed to you, eventually you're getting into deeper and deeper ideological content, where you may have an image of like a woman baking bread or whatever, and on top of it you'll see like rules for being a obedient wife, for example.
In the last, I would say, like 10 years, 5 years even, there's been a shift to where like far right groups, and even just right conservative groups have pulled in what it means to be crunchy and essentialized it with the idea of being anti-vax, of being for parental rights and being for having more of a say in their children's education, not just in what they're eating, but in what they're hearing. So it's very much connected to a lot of these ideas. So within this institutional church, Pope Francis, who is viewed with suspicion by traditionalists, is cracking down on traditionalist groups. So it's kind of setting up this culture and spiritual war that many radical traditionalists are pulling on for their language of militancy and spiritual violence within the church. So one example that I specifically want to mention here was that a while ago there was an incident where Pope Francis had welcomed a group from the Amazon, and they had brought with them small wooden icons of Pachamama, which is this mother goddess. A radical traditionalist Catholic broke into the church where the Pachamama statues were being held and threw them into the Tiber River. So that was kind of an inciting incident where this young white
Yeah,
European radical traditionalist Catholic was not only exalting, and as we've seen now, kind of this radical traditionalist Catholic masculinity, but
right.
framing it as kind of this life and death struggle.
Ooh,
Um, yeah,
yikes.
yeah.
Not
um,
good.
Not good, not good. And the same of that, we're seeing this spread not only to lay people, but also a group of poor Clare nuns in Spain announced recently their break from the church. So I will note that groups like Opus Dei, SSPX, they're groups that have received special dispensations historically from the church for their association with different power dynamics. Also, SSPX's ability to continue holding the traditional Latin Mass. So it gets especially complicated into power dynamics, not only within the US, but also within the church.
100%. Yeah, and I always like to note that Opus Dei has a concentrated number of members in Washington, D.C., so having a lot of people that are involved in various level of politics, so I think that's just worth pulling out too. So Catholic nationalism is influencing policy debates, judicial appointments, and even school curriculums. We've seen Catholic nationalist groups working to shape laws that reflect their vision of a Christian nation once again, pushing for restrictions on reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus protections, and even education about history. And on a note of the anti Pope Francis line of thinking, Joseph Strickland recently said, quote, "If the Holy Father and the many cardinals, bishops, and priests who clamor to his side refuse to reject the siren call of sodomy, we must remain steadfast. True mercy toward our brothers in holy orders demands that we tirelessly call them back to the truth, regardless of how deaf their ears may remain to our pleas." in my notes I put that he's such a flamboyant martyr with his on brand traditionalist beard that he grew after he was removed as bishop. And I think that quote is noteworthy for the anti LGBTQ obviously angle. And you know, it's just a very interesting position to be in for someone who was a bishop to now be saying things like that about the Pope and setting up this idea, like really overtly referring to this idea of this battle with two sides. Like, well, the Pope is not on the right side.
And I think also an important thing that Strickland's quotes talks about is this idea of anti-Christian, anti-Catholic bias, is kind of this victimhood and martyrdom construct that many radical traditionalists and far-right Catholics, many leaders, including people you mentioned earlier, like J.D. Vance, like Candace Owen, have perpetuated recently on social media platforms, but also in political spaces. Trump recently came out with an executive order about anti Christian bias and kind of seeking to correct that. But notably, several of the examples that he included were of Catholic individuals in the United States, notably Catholic people who had been charged with disrupting access to reproductive justice clinics, people who had also been arrested for religious protest and resistance related crimes. But in the same sense, it's this construction of a martyrdom complex that evangelical scholars of evangelical Christianity, have been highlighting for a long time.
Absolutely. And we've also seen that this movement in America also has global implications. In Europe, we're seeing alliances between far right parties and traditionalist Catholic factions as well, with leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary. I hope I said his name right, Emma.
That sounds right.
Embracing this ideology. Not theology, thank goodness. It's just ideology.
Yes.
um, there's a transatlantic exchange of ideas, strategies, and funding that's fueling this resurgence, which now leads us to Poland, Emma.
100%. I've been waiting. So, ironically, because in the past I've done work on social media related to veiling research. So, exemplified by what you say, Max, that largely a lot of these traditionalist Catholic groups would remain isolated if it were not this internet age that we live in. Many of the women that I spoke to loved and found this experience of veiling independently, maybe through like a Catholic conference that they were part of, through their local parish. But the spread of the practice online and founding of support networks happened because of social media. And arguably, the practice also spread and found solidification and foundation in radical traditionalist Catholic circles because of groups like Facebook. So, in the same way, that's how I actually met Damian Guzek and Jan Slomka, one of whom is a priest in Poland, and the other one is a digital media scholar. And they specifically are looking at the idea of cartoons that are anti Pope Francis in Poland that have also been associated with far right Polish Catholic nationalist movements. So, again, seeing the conflation of this anti Francis radical traditionalist movement in a country that, just like the United States, is seeing the radical overturn of abortion exemptions, which has been extremely devastating and elicited a lot of very Catholic iconography based resistance in Poland, involving symbology around the Mother of God. But it's happening in the same way as the United States, and Poland's witnessing a lot of the same things. So that was how my connection with Damian Guzek and Jan Slomka happened. But a lot of their research focuses on how these cartoons specifically are the product of antagonistic and anti-Pope Francis forces internal to the church, but also how they're evidence of radical traditionalist Catholics engaging purposefully and creating their own media online for visualizing what these networks of resistance look like.
Absolutely. That's a really good window into the global implications because, again, with technology, it makes kind of all of these issues be global issues, not just isolated in America. I also wanted to turn to a moment that I had during my deconstruction. So, kind of, we're talking about this kind of zoomed out big picture, and I kind of wanted to make it personal now for a moment for me. when I was thinking about what I believed, I wanted to hold to all the parts of Catholic faith that were so instrumental and guided me throughout so many years. I wanted to hold to my relationship with God. And importantly, it was that relationship with God where my discernment process with God in finding my trans identity was so impactful to me to find this flourishing of my true self. But in my deconstruction phase, I remember thinking, why do these systems of power exist at all? These systems of power that are being abused in different ways by different groups and institutions. It's kind of like people would often say to me, well, the whole church is not bad. It's just, you have just encountered some bad people. And it's like, well, the church is a system that exists in society that has perpetuated harm like other systems have. And so I came to that question: why do these systems of power exist at all? And I think the truth is that human beings are drawn to creating these systems, and then what ends up happening is that the system itself becomes sort of elevated and glorified, worshipped in and of itself, kind of like having a idolatry about the something that you have yourself created, which I guess that's kind of what idolatry just means in general.
No, but it's well said. It's a good explanation of what it is.
It's like the singular entity of whatever this thing that you've created becomes more valuable than the lives and the well-being and the dignity of other people. We see that as well when it's like people historically have been so afraid to publicly accuse or call out or hold accountable members of clergy who have committed abuse. And it's like literally the fear of the office, the fear of the collar itself. I think that this is one of the key issues with fundamentalism, and the type of fundamentalism that leads to the Catholic nationalism that we're talking about, because unshakable devotion to something that's like an earthly thing. Again, it's something that is created, and it is God's church, but like it's perpetuated, built, maintained by humans, and humans are fallible, and so when you have this unshakable devotion to something, and you can't ever question it, and it's a human made system, it tends to necessitate eventually violence towards others who may have differing views or a differing tradition that they come from, because you're so attached. And that's why I use that word idolatrous, because I feel like it becomes that.
100%, 100%. And I think this touches on what we shared earlier about the idea that if there's a singular issue, especially that a lot of far right groups try to essentialize for elections, for not only political elections, but also the support and legitimization of Catholic and religious leaders. And if that issue is related to abortion, those systems are finding easy, effective ways to say that, just as you say, the dignity of LGBTQ plus people, people's access to reproductive care and reproductive justice, communities of immigrant individuals that have come into the United States that are now being slandered, but also unfairly and unethically and unmorally targeted, is creating a system in which, in the minds of radical traditionalists and far right Catholic nationalists, they can justify the violence that they commit against others because at least they're perpetuating the singular issue. But you know me, and I love a good history dive.
Yes.
Americans who believed that they had a birthright, which, again, as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, is so inherently wrong because there were people on this land, especially these white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people in the United States, believing that they had a birthright to the land that they were on and to the political power that they wielded, allowed them to justify the violence that they committed against people of color, against women, against immigrant communities, against Catholic individuals, in the same way that we're seeing today. And it was all in service of the idea of protecting very much what they talked about of kind of this purity of white Protestant women, but also the survival of kind of this white supremacist race. And I will also mention that Sarah Mosliner delves into this in her podcast, Pure White, which is a great place to learn more about this history because we can only touch on a little drop in the bucket of what this history is. But I also want to highlight that it was the same system of belief that in order to preserve the stability and the sacredness and purity of this white Christian Protestant community and bloodline, that they could therefore justify violence against these communities. And it's the same one that's developing with the Catholic purist construct today.
No, I think that's absolutely important and critical to include those things. And on the topic though of the like historically negative response to Catholics, I think Emma that you actually have a pretty striking personal story about that.
100%. So, and we think about this idea of anti Catholic KKK activity as being something that's really old. But I will specifically mention that my grandfather remembers um, like witnessing like fellow people in Louisville, in around the Kentucky, Indiana area that was in the heart of this Bible Belt, like having like flaming crosses placed on their lawns. So this wasn't an isolated or long time away incident. And I emphasize it in the same way that when I was an undergrad at Ball State University, I was studying systems of anti Semitism that's at the crux of these WASP and Christian nationalist white supremacist systems. Um, and in the same way that there were what they called sundown towns, where people of color were said basically could not, like, would not be safe in towns after dark. In a lot of these isolated rural communities, but not necessarily completely isolated in rural communities, many larger ones. It was the same for many Jewish individuals and many Catholics. So, definitely, and I think important to note here is that this construction of this Catholic nationalism today is also deeply related to race. Just as Mosliner talks about in her podcast, white supremacy is inherent to any form of nationalism. Really, Catholic nationalism is influencing these Supreme Court rulings, state laws, and even the way that history is being taught in schools. It's shaping the next generation's understanding of faith and politics in a way that privileges a very specific exclusionary vision of Catholicism.
Here's why conversations like this matter. Fundamentalism thrives when people don't recognize it for what it is. By identifying it, calling it out, and refusing to let it operate unchecked, we can push back against these systems of control. The more we understand the forces that are at play, the better we can challenge them.
100%. And we shouldn't underestimate our own power in all of this. Change doesn't just happen at the highest levels, it happens in our everyday lives, in the way we engage with our communities, in the conversations that we have, and in the choices that we make on a daily basis. Everyone has a role to play, whether that's advocating for justice, supporting progressive faith communities or progressive faith leaders, or simply refusing to accept fear and exclusion as the default.
No movement is inevitable. Catholic nationalism might be on the rise, but so is the resistance to it. We have more power than we think, and history shows us that people who challenge these narratives, who push for a more inclusive, just, and compassionate world, can and do make a difference. We can all use our privilege in society and our voices to make sure that these important issues are openly discussed.
100%. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, both of us got out. Both of us got out and challenged these ideas so early in our lives because we couldn't exist as we were authentically within these systems. As a result of this, it can be widely different for other people. It can be difficult to distance yourself from these systems and step outside of them and seek dissonant information if these systems are the ones that are inherently benefiting you. And it may seem like they're benefiting you, but not necessarily, in the same sense that people who associate themselves with tradwife movements, with the far right crunchy movement, as we talked about, think that these systems and far right politicians and radical traditionalist Catholic communities prioritize and privilege their own information. But that's not inherently true. Just in the same way as we talk about in the masculinity series, that just because you are a white male, a young white male, who is exerting power over one another, that you yourself are not deeply affected and harmed by systems that perpetuate white male privilege. And then I'll kick it over to you, Max, in your experience.
Well, and yeah, that last point that you made is something that I read this book that it's a huge book. I listened to it on audiobook, so it took me about 30 hours to get through. It's called Stiffed by Susan Faludi, and from the title, you can see that it speaks to that disenchantment, disillusionment of men who participate in these systems in which they believe themselves to be at the pinnacle, and yet something is also not right because they are also being taken advantage of in the system. As you say, Emma, and I think you say that so beautifully and so well, there wasn't a place for me as a transgender person. And so, in taking a step back to say, okay, well, I feel called through to this transgender identity because I can see how it will be the full flourishing of me that God does desire for me. Through that process, I have experienced and seen so many different people at so many different stages in disengaging from different levels of fundamentalism or conservatism. And what I have noticed is that within those systems, they make it seem like that there's only a limited number of problems and that those problems affect everybody equally, which is so incorrect because there intersectionality exists, diversity exists. Somebody like JD Vance should understand this because he married somebody who's not white. Like
Yeah.
there are complex levels to every problem, and sometimes it's obvious. Like when you're a queer person who was raised in a Catholic family, and you're like, well, there's not much space here to be queer in this fundamentalist household. But it could be something simple. I knew a couple that had fertility issues in their church community, and basically they were hounded constantly by the community in regards to like, well, are you praying? Like, are you doing this? Are you doing that? Instead of that community having any sensitivity to the situation that they were in. So I think that's kind of this element of there is going to be something that affects you. You just may not know what it is. And blindly trusting in a system, a black and white system that has been presented to you as the answer is probably not the best strategy to succeed in this life that is full of unpredictable issues that can just come up and affect you.
100%. And I think also building on that, it's very much this idea of a quantification, not only of rights, but of the ways in which people are affected and can be affected and affect other systems. So it's this idea that I think, especially among discussions of how LGBTQ plus people that we delve into this podcast are affected and affect religious spaces and faith experiences, there's an idea of trying to essentialize but also like localize like what every single queer person who has ever gone through a faith system will look like, what every single queer Catholic person who has gone through these systems will experience, and how they will either remain in them, get out, deconstruct. But as what we talked about in our last episode, and what we hope to do in the future, is this idea that it's all going to be different based on what privileges and opportunities a person has, but also because this isn't going to be a one-track definition. Just as we're talking about discussions of a person's rights and access to critical, important care and information and knowledge about their own bodies and communities is going to be a diverse, nuanced conversation for everyone.
And that is more difficult to accept, especially when the only system that you've had for your whole life is a very black and white way of looking at things. But there's plenty of evidence that a stronger, greater resiliency comes from being able to have a higher, I think they often talk about it in research as like a higher openness level. And it's just obvious. It's because like in the caveman days, if you weren't going to work together with the group, you were going to die. Being able to be open to hearing other ideas and to seeing other perspectives is such an important thing. And the way that that builds into resiliency is it allows you to draw strength and pull strength from different traditions, from different people from different ideas. It's why I feel so passionate and why it's meant so much to me, for example, to become friends with Emma, because even though we have very different backgrounds and perspectives, like pretty different. I mean, we have cultural similarities with growing up in the US and with Catholicism, but Emma is a lesbian and I'm a transgender man. So like
Yeah.
we have different experiences of like the issues that impacted us growing up. We are able to draw a lot of support from each other as we are navigating these things. And so part of what I am really hoping and intending for this podcast and for the listeners is that we can model what some of that looks like, because when I was trying to find my way out, it would have been really great to see an example of people who are doing that work in a open way and not saying, okay, as you say, we're not essentialing the queer Catholic experience. It's the queer Catholic experience is not just one thing. It is dynamic and very individual.
100%. 100%. And it's the idea that resistance isn't just about opposing something, it's about creating something new. Namely, this podcast is an act of resistance, a vision of faith that's rooted in justice, love, and liberation from our own experiences. A world where Catholicism isn't a tool of exclusion, but rather, as we envision it, a source of radical hospitality and care for ourselves and for others.
And for the community. We are not powerless in this fight. Every conversation we have, every story we share and tell, every moment we choose community over control, we are shaping the future. It's this idea that our own unique individual actions and the seemingly small things that we do really make a difference and do have a big ripple effect. It's about lifting each other up and making space for something better.
100%. And as I will say 1,000,000,001 times, probably you all will get tired of hearing it, the truth is we've seen this before. The church has always been a place of tension and transformation. And that means there's always hope and space for people to find opportunities to feel seen, but also to help others see themselves. Change is possible, liberation is possible, and a faith that nurtures rather than dominates is possible.
And we're not alone. Across the world, people are challenging fundamentalism, standing up for justice, and reclaiming faith on our own terms. We're part of something bigger than ourselves, and that's worth holding on to.
So let's keep going. Let's keep asking questions, pushing back, and dreaming of something better and bigger. Because the story of faith isn't just one of power and control. It's also one of courage, defiance, and the relentless pursuit of justice. And that's what we want to keep exploring. If you have thoughts, questions, or ideas for future episodes, guests you'd like us to talk about these incredibly important ideas with, discussion points and present incredibly reticent modern news events to respond to, let us know. We hope this is an ongoing conversation with you as a viewer about your own experiences of finding space, but also finding a path forward.
And thank you so much for listening. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, of course, Substack, maxwellkuzma.substack.com. And let's keep the conversation going. Until next time.